The train screeched as it pulled into Grand Central Station, its metal wheels grinding against the rails in a tired groan that echoed through the cavernous hall. Evelyn Carter clutched the handle of her worn leather suitcase, her fingers numb from the chill of a late February morning. New York City smelled different from Ohio, an intoxicating mixture of exhaust fumes, roasted chestnuts, and the faint tang of ambition. She inhaled deeply, letting the scent fill her lungs like a promise. She had dreamed of this moment for years, ever since she first flipped through the glossy pages of Vogue under the covers of her childhood bed, imagining herself draped in silk, her paintings hanging in galleries where critics sipped martinis and spoke in hushed, reverent tones. It was 1966, and the world was changing fast. The Beatles were everywhere. Women were marching for equality. And somewhere far away, boys her age were dying in a jungle they could barely pronounce. Evelyn's heart thumped like a bass drum as she stepped off the train. The station was a cathedral of steel and marble, sunlight streaming through the windows to catch motes of dust floating lazily in the air. A violinist played near the exit, his bow scraping a lonely tune that made her chest ache. She wondered how many people had come here with the same hope, the same trembling excitement, and how many would leave disappointed. Outside, the city roared. Yellow cabs honked impatiently. Men in tailored suits hurried past women in bright shift dresses, and street vendors called out, hawking everything from hot dogs to postcards. Evelyn gripped her suitcase tighter and hailed a cab, her voice trembling slightly as she gave the driver the address of her new home. A tiny apartment on the Lower East Side that a friend of a friend had promised was cheap, but with character. Character, as it turned out, meant peeling wallpaper, a radiator that clanged like a jazz drummer, and a view of the brick wall next door. Still, it was hers. She unpacked her sketchbooks and paints onto a rickety table, hung her coat on a nail in the wall, and stood by the single window, staring out at the sliver of sky between tenements. The streets below teemed with life, a constant hum of possibility and chaos. That night, she wandered through the streets, letting the city wrap around her like a living organism. Music drifted from open windows, folk singers strumming guitars, a jazz quartet playing under dim lights, and laughter spilled from bars as couples danced, oblivious to the world outside. She didn't know then that the sound would lead her to him. The Blue Lantern was the kind of place you didn't find on a map. You stumbled into it by accident, following the hum of bass through a narrow alley until you saw the chipped blue door with no sign. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and possibility. A crowd of beat poets, college kids, and men in berets hunched over their drinks while a quartet played under dim lights. The smell of whiskey mingled with tobacco and the faint perfume of someone's ambition. Evelyn had come on a whim, drawn by the music drifting up from the subway as she wandered aimlessly that first weekend. She slipped into a seat at the back, her heart thrumming in time with the drums. And then she saw him. He sat on a stool at the edge of the stage, a Gibson guitar cradled in his hands, his head bent low so that his dark hair fell across his eyes. He played like someone trying to wring truth from the strings, his fingers coaxing out notes that made Evelyn's chest ache in a way she couldn't explain. When the set ended, she watched as he carried his guitar to the bar, ordering a whiskey neat. She hesitated, then walked over, her pulse quickening with every step. "You play beautifully," she said, her voice barely audible over the chatter. He looked up, and for the first time, she saw his eyes a gray so pale they seemed almost silver, haunted and gentle all at once. "Thanks," he said, his voice low, roughened at the edges. "Name's James. Evelyn." She offered her hand, and he shook it, his calloused fingers warm against hers. They talked until the bartender flipped the chairs onto the tables, about music and art, and why they both had come to this city that promised everything and nothing at the same time. He didn't talk about the war, though she sensed it clinging to him like smoke. Later, she would learn about the scars he kept hidden, but that night he only smiled faintly and asked if she'd be back. She nodded, though she didn't know then that she would come back every night, just to hear him play. Weeks slipped into months. Evelyn painted in the mornings in the cramped apartment, then wandered down to Bleecker Street at dusk, sketchbook tucked under her arm like a secret. James was always there. Sometimes on stage, sometimes at the bar, his guitar case propped against the wall like an old friend. They became each other's refuge, from the loneliness of a city that didn't yet know her name. He, from the ghosts that followed him home at night. He told her bits and pieces of himself like torn pages from a book. That he grew up in Boston, that his father wanted him to be an accountant, that the jungle smelled like rotting fruit and fear. She didn't press when his hands trembled lighting a cigarette or when he stared too long at nothing. In return, she showed him her world, the bright canvases that covered every inch of her apartment, splashes of color that felt like rebellion. He laughed when she smudged blue paint on his cheek, his first real laugh in months, and in that moment she knew she was falling. On a humid night in July, they kissed for the first time in the doorway of the Blue Lantern, the city humming around them like a distant radio. It tasted of whiskey and hope and something else, something fragile, like a promise neither of them dared to speak. The summer of 1967 burned hot, not just in the streets of New York but across the country. Radios crackled with news of riots in Detroit, marches in Washington, and protests against a war that seemed to have no end. Posters plastered on lampposts demanded peace now. Young men burned draft cards in Union Square, their faces lit by flames and fury. Evelyn felt it all thrumming through the city like a fever. The chaos outside mirrored the stirrings inside her chest. Ambition, fear, hope, and longing all tangled together. She and James watched from the fringes, hands intertwined as they walked past students chanting slogans under banners that read, "Hell no, we won't go." James's jaw tightened whenever he heard the words Vietnam or draft, the muscle ticking involuntarily. Evelyn noticed the way his eyes flicked to uniformed men in the photos in the newspapers, the way he flinched at car backfires that split the air like gunfire. One night, as they sat on the fire escape outside her apartment, the bottle of cheap wine between them sweating in the heat, she asked the question she had been holding back for weeks. Was it bad? James stared at the city lights for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It was hell. He didn't say more, and Evelyn didn't press. Instead, she reached for his hand, and he let her hold it, fingers tightening around hers like a lifeline. Above them, the stars seemed muted by the city glow, but she imagined each one as a witness to their quiet, fragile peace. By autumn, Evelyn's paintings had grown bold riotous explosions of color that mirrored both the chaos outside her window and the quiet storms inside her chest. The gallery scene began noticing her work. Small shows, hushed praise, and murmurs of brilliance from those who claimed to know art. James came to the opening of her first gallery show in Soho. He wore the suit he had saved for weddings, the one stiff from years of storage, and he carried with him a quiet pride and an almost imperceptible tension. The gallery was intimate, every inch of whitewashed wall hung with color and emotion. Critics whispered to each other, patrons sipped wine, and Evelyn felt simultaneously exposed and invincible. James stayed by her side, hands in pockets, eyes scanning the crowd, like a guardian watching over something precious. Later, walking home through the chill of October, he finally spoke. "I should be happy for you. And I am. But," he trailed off, running a hand through his hair, and for once, he seemed smaller than usual, almost human in his fragility. "But what?" He stopped under a street lamp, yellow light splintering across his features. "I don't know where I fit anymore. Over there, I was someone, a soldier. Here, I'm just another guy with a guitar in a smoky bar." She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You're more than that, James. You're—" She broke off, afraid the word would crumble under the weight of truth. Instead, she kissed him, pouring all her unsaid words into the press of her lips. That night, when she thought he had fallen asleep beside her, he slipped quietly into the hall, leaving her with the heavy stillness of absence. James's absences grew longer as months passed. Some nights, he didn't appear at the Blue Lantern at all. Other nights, he played like a man possessed, fingers flying across the strings, trying to outrun something that haunted him from within. Evelyn worried but said nothing, fearful of pushing him further away. She poured herself into her art, painting until her wrists ached, and until the apartment seemed a riot of color and chaos. She listened to his records while she painted Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Billie Holiday melodies that wound through her like smoke curling around her heart. Then, one cold November evening, she found him in Washington Square Park, perched on a bench with his guitar case at his feet, staring at the fountain as if it held all the answers. "James," she whispered, kneeling beside him, "where have you been?" He looked at her with eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. "Trying to breathe," he said. "Some days, it feels like the war never ended. Like I never left that jungle." Her heart broke for him, but she didn't speak. Instead, she sat with him, pressed close on that cold stone bench, until the city spun on around them, oblivious, and they clung to the fragile warmth of presence. Winter settled over New York like a gray wool blanket, heavy and unrelenting. Snow piled along the curbs, blackened by soot and tire slush. Evelyn's apartment was drafty, the radiator hissing and clanking in a futile battle against the chill. She painted with fingerless gloves, her breath misting in the air as she dragged her brush across the canvas. James came and went, like the wind, sometimes warm and tender, sometimes sharp and distant. He played more gigs now, hustling from club to club, always chasing that elusive break that might turn smoky nights into something more. Evelyn worried silently whenever he disappeared, walking the streets of Manhattan with only the neon lights as his companion. But there were moments, brief, luminous moments, that made the city itself fade away. One Christmas Eve, he appeared at her door with a brown paper bag of Chinese takeout and a single red ribbon he tied in her hair. "No tree?" she teased, laughter escaping despite the cold that had seeped into her bones. "You're all the decoration I need," he said, his voice soft but sincere. Later, as snow drifted past the window, they lay tangled in her narrow bed, her head resting on his chest. She listened to the steady pulse of his heartbeat and felt a fragile sense of safety, as if time itself had paused to let them breathe. By February, cracks began to show. The Blue Lantern closed without warning, its chip door nailed shut, a casualty of rising rents and police raids. James was furious, pacing her apartment like a caged animal. "They're killing it," he spat. "All of it. The music, the scene, everything real." James and Evelyn reached for him, but he jerked away, frustration simmering in his gray eyes. "I need to get out of here. Maybe head to California." They say there's a whole new thing happening out there, Monterey, San Francisco. All of it. Freedom. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Evelyn's stomach twisted. What about us? She asked softly, the fear of losing him clawing at her throat. He looked at her, and the storm in his eyes almost broke her heart. I don't know, Eve. I'm trying to keep my head above water, and some days I feel like I'm drowning. She wanted to beg him to stay, to force the world to pause for them. Instead, she turned toward the window, blinking against the sting of tears. Outside, the city pulsed with neon and noise, indifferent to the tiny tragedies unfolding in its shadows. March arrived, raw and wet, streets slick with rain. Evelyn stood on the platform at Penn Station, coat collar turned up against the wind. James was leaving for California just for a while, he had said, but his eyes told another story. He slung his guitar case over his shoulder, leather worn and soft from years of handling. Write to me, she said, hating how small her voice sounded amidst the roar of the crowd. Every day, he promised, though promises were easy in the echo of departure. The train whistle blew, and she kissed him hard, tasting salt, whiskey, and the sharp ache of something breaking inside her. I'll come back, he murmured against her hair. I swear. And then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd and the hiss of steam, leaving her with nothing but the faint scent of tobacco and the hollow echo of his footsteps. That night, Evelyn returned to her empty apartment and stared at the blank canvas propped against the wall. For hours, she sat motionless, listening to the city below, until finally she picked up a brush and began to paint not faces, but raw emotion, violent strokes of crimson, black, and blue, like the bleeding of a heart tad. On to linen. Spring arrived timidly, buds pushing through cracks in the concrete, but Evelyn barely noticed. Her world had shrunk to the mailbox downstairs and the empty space beside her bed. At first, the letters came every few days as scribbled postcards from California, with sun-bleached photographs of the Pacific coast and notes that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. You'd love it here, Eve. Everything feels wide open. The music's alive, like it has a heartbeat. But as the weeks passed, the letters grew shorter, less frequent, like footsteps fading down a long hallway. By June, they stopped altogether. Evelyn tried to fill the void with color, throwing herself into her art. She painted until her wrists ached, and the apartment looked like a riot of sunlight and shadow. Critics called her the restless heart of a restless decade. Yet despite acclaim, she felt hollow. She would wander the city at night, sketchbook in hand, tracing the streets they had walked together, replaying conversations, kisses, laughter that now echoed like ghosts. She didn't know if James was alive, if he even thought of her, and that uncertainty gnawed at her relentlessly. It was late summer when she saw him, a Gnor rather, a version of him. Evelyn was in a corner newsstand, flipping through Life magazine, when her gaze snagged on a black and white photograph. A man on stage at the Monterey Pop Festival, guitar slung low, hair longer than she remembered, head thrown back in a moment of raw ecstasy. The caption read, James Donovan, rising star of the West Coast Sound. Her breath caught. She bought the magazine with trembling hands and carried it home like contraband. For hours, she stared at the image, tracing the sharp lines of his jaw, the wild abandon in his pose. He looked different, freer, perhaps, but the eyes were the same. Silver gray, haunted, alive. Evelyn poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, the magazine spread open on her lap. Outside, the city roared, oblivious to her private ache. That night, she dreamt of him, playing guitar on a sunlit stage while she painted 1,000 colors into the sky. October blew in with sharp winds and rust-colored leaves, rattling the windows of Evelyn's apartment. She was preparing for another gallery show when the knock came 3 soft raps, tentative, almost apologetic. She opened the door. James stood in the hallway, duffel bag at his feet, hair longer, shoulders thinner, a new hollowness etched into his cheeks. But his storm-gray eyes were fixed on her with the intensity she remembered. "Eve," he whispered. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the air thick with months of absence. Then she stepped aside, and he walked in, setting the bag down with a soft thud. Neither spoke as she closed the door. The city hummed beyond the walls, indifferent, but inside that small apartment, time paused. Finally, James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. "I wrote," he said hoarsely. "Every day. I just never sent them." He dropped the bundle of unsent letters on the table. Relief, anger, and love collided inside her chest, and for the first time in months, the air between them seemed breathable. Before she could speak, he crossed the room and kissed her, desperate and searching, tasting of salt and longing, bridging the gap of all the miles and months that had separated them. The apartment smelled of turpentine and autumn rain, the old radiator ticking softly like a metronome. James sat on the edge of her narrow bed, hunched over his guitar, fingers idly picking out a tune that sounded like heartbreak. Evelyn stood at the window, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the city lights flickering in the dark. "You could have called," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "I know." His hand stilled on the strings. "I tried. Every time I picked up the phone, I couldn't do it. Couldn't explain why I left, why I didn't come back sooner. Try now." He set the guitar aside and stood, closing the space between them. The years had etched fine lines around his eyes, marks of sleepless nights and battles he carried silently. "I thought I needed California," he said. "Thought if I played enough, if I stayed high enough, I could outrun everything, the war, the noise in my head, even us. But none of it worked. The music got bigger, the crowds louder, but inside," he pressed a fist to his chest. "Inside, it was just empty. And now?" Her voice cracked on the word. "Now I know the only time I felt whole was here, with you." Her breath hitched, anger and longing warring inside her. "Do you know what it was like, James? Waiting, not knowing if you were alive, if you even cared I cared," he said fiercely. "Every damn day." He reached for her then, and for a heartbeat she wanted to pull away, to make him feel the hurt she'd carried like a stone. But when his arms closed around her, the fight drained out of her, leaving only the truth. She had never stopped loving him. They moved through the days cautiously, like tightrope walkers afraid of the fall. James found work at a small recording studio downtown, cutting demo tracks for folk singers with voices like gravel and smoke. Evelyn's career soared her bold, chaotic canvases captured something of the times, and critics called her the restless heart of a restless decade. But outside their fragile cocoon, the world burned. The war raged on. Martin Luther King was gone. Bobby Kennedy, too. The city thrummed with protest marches and sirens, and sometimes James would come home late, eyes shadowed, hands trembling from memories he couldn't shake. One night, after a benefit concert for returning veterans, he found her in the kitchen, barefoot in an old paint-streaked dress, humming to herself as she stirred a pot of soup. For a moment he just watched, the simple domesticity almost surreal after years of chaos. "What?" she asked, smiling softly. "Nothing." He slipped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Just, I didn't think I'd get this. Not after everything. You deserve it," she said, though a shadow crossed her heart, because she knew how fragile happiness could be, how easily it could splinter under the weight of the world. The decade ended the way it began, in a blur of change and noise. Woodstock came and went like a fever dream. Men walked on the moon, while others bled in rice paddies. And through it all, Evelyn and James clung to each other, weathering storms both public and private. One night in December 1969, they stood on the rooftop of their building, the city glittering below like 1,000 tiny galaxies. Snow drifted in lazy spirals, catching in Evelyn's dark hair like flecks of silver. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked, her breath clouding in the cold. "Every day," James said. He took her hand, his fingers warm despite the chill. "But, for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of it." She looked at him, then really looked and saw, not the broken soldier who had stumbled into her life, nor the restless musician chasing a dream down endless highways, but the man who had fought his way back from the edge for the chance to stand here, under this wide, indifferent sky, holding her hand. When he kissed her, it was slow and certain. The kind of kiss that felt like a promise, one they both knew might bend under the weight of the world. But for now, in this moment, it was enough. The wind swept through the city, carrying the sound of distant sirens, laughter, and the faint, aching strains of a guitar. And above it all, the snow kept falling. Soft as forgiveness, bright as hope.